Welcome to Conscious Conversations, and my name's Luke McLean. So, what is Conscious Conversations? It's a long form podcast where I want to have deep and meaningful discussions with people who I believe are living from a place of authenticity and purpose. And what I want to do in these podcasts is unpack their story, their insights, their learnings, and get a really nice look at their lens on life. And why I want to do this is because I want to help people to step into their authentic and true self. That's what I do as a life coach and meditation teacher every day. And this podcast is an extension of that. That's all it is this chance to see people who are actually really successful, but they've been successful and they've been able to create shifts and changes in other people and themselves from a place of authenticity, from their truest self, that they're feeling fulfilled, that they've got energy and vitality in what they do every day. It's not a grind and it's not a rub of, I have to do this to get that, and the cost is my well-being, happiness, contentment. There's always has to be a cost. I don't believe that, and that's what I'm trying to get in these podcasts. So that's really what the essence of Conscious Conversations about. I just want to, anyone that's interested, talk about a coaching program or a session that I've got going at the moment called Reset. I just feel like it's a really important time right now to talk to people, especially with what's going on, is this ability to sort of reflect on who you are, to reflect on your values, your current actions and behaviors, your current self-talk, and to get really clear on where you are right now, to reflect on that, and then to build the bridge and reset to the person that you feel is your authentic self, and to start to look at how does it show up in a framework. What are the actions and behaviors? What are the relationships? What are the connections and environments that you need to cultivate to show up and be your truest version of you? And that's really what the Reset coaching session is about. And, really what my coaching is about as a whole. And Reset's really a 90-minute session to really start afresh and help people create the space to do that. I think we've got well intentioned to do that, but we rarely find the time, and that's what Reset's about. If that sounds like you, if that sounds like something that would interest you, head over to lukemclean.net, go to Life and Wellness Coaching. The Reset program's there, but there's also a free 20-minute coaching session that I offer to all clients before we start. And if you would like to have a conversation with me, have a session just for 20 minutes to talk about where you are, what are some of the challenges, what you're wanting to get from life, what are you wanting to get from coaching, I'm more than happy and willing and want to talk to people about that with no pressure to take on more sessions. So again, you can head over to lukemclean.net and take a look around. But enough of that. Let's get into today's episode. I reach out to so many people to come on Conscious Conversations. So many people are inspiring me, authors, teachers, meditation teachers, wellness experts, and sometimes you get a response from a person that they're really living from this authentic place. And, Kevin Courtney is a yoga, meditation, and spiritual teacher. He's world-renowned in the work that he does, especially in yoga and meditation. He's been doing this a long time, since 2002. And, he's sort of on that forefront of the modern day, yoga experience. He's based in New York, and, he's featured, in publications such as Well and Good, in Vogue and the New York Times. And he's also got a multitude of meditations and yoga sessions on Gaia. And if you haven't been to Gaia, it's almost like a spirituality Netflix that has documentaries, it has yoga, meditation, series. I share a lot of stuff on my email campaigns every month around that. So, he's a regular contributor to that. And, today I got the chance to talk to Kevin about his wellness journey, his spiritual journey, and, his growth as a person through yoga, through meditation, and through self-transformation. And we tap into a little bit of that, which is really beautiful about, how he goes about that process of self-discovery. We talk about energy, we talk about yoga, we talk about awareness, and we also finish with this really beautiful conversation around the future of consciousness and spirituality, and what this 2020 will grow humanity into in the future. And I think there's a really nice endpoint for this conversation. So that's what we've got today. Without further ado, my name's Luke McLean. You're listening to Conscious Conversation. And this episode is with yoga, meditation, and spiritual teacher, Kevin Courtney. I wanted to start, Kevin. I just got on your website, mate, and I loved the opening bit, the opening part of your insight, introduction, which stated, "Feel until the felt becomes seen, the seen becomes understood, the understood becomes known, the known becomes wisdom, wisdom becomes the light through which your eyes come to see." This is insight, and mate, that's beautiful. Like, it's one of the more, I guess, insightful but clearer explanations of what so many people like us are trying to do.
No,
Can you elaborate
appreciate it.
on, how did you get there with that? Like, what was that for you to, A, put it on your website, and B, sort of what you stand for, but what was it like to get that within yourself?
Yeah. I appreciate the question, and just being able to have the conversation, for sure, and just think about some of these things from this perspective. That really, that language and that framework was probably about a 7-year process. And if I kind of go back to the first stage of the work, which was in about 2013, that makes me think of the 15 years before that. You know what I mean? So it really was an aggregate of first teaching yoga to a classroom, like teaching public yoga classes and teacher trainings, and being in that conversation for about 15 years or so. And then basically I started to look at my life and look at what I was doing. And I think, I think back to that time, and when I started teaching yoga, this was in 2001, 2002, and I remember I was making the conscious choice to put my head down for minimum 10 years and just teach, and not think about any other ambition other than coming to understand the content of what I was talking about. And I was teaching physical yoga practices, but I was very much interested and dedicated to the science as a whole. So it was never really just about the physical practice to me. So I was studying Gyani Yoga, which is, just for anybody that might not know that term, that word Gyana can translate as insight or knowledge. And it works off of the premise that there's essentially the truth of the matter, which is, like, in that context, that we're that light, that is the last phrase of that line, like the wisdom becomes the light through which you see, and that notion of that light or that essence or that wisdom becoming the perspective was something that I started with back in 2001, and going like, oh, okay, that's really interesting, because as far as I know, my reality was in that paradigm of ego and mind, and at that time ego and mind still felt very viscerally real, and if you were to tell me that it wasn't, I would push back with great force on that. And so I look at that time as kind of the beginning, and then fast forward to 2013, and I was basically, okay, I've been doing this for 12 years now. how am I going to generate greater impact? Which is, I think, something a lot of people are asking themselves nowadays. But for me, that was about a 2-year meditation on how can I go from teaching yoga to generating a greater impact in the world. And I felt like, in a sense, I was getting to the point where I was preaching to the choir and was getting an itch to have more of an impact, to diversify the people that I was in contact with that wisdom of the tradition. And so I sat with that for about 2 years to say, like, what form would that take? And then it came through in a meditation, actually, with like a ton of bricks. I mean, I was in a daily meditation practice at that point for 13 or 14 years. And part of my practice was to take in to the meditation a question. And so for, roughly about I would say more like 2 to 3 years, I was in that meditation of this question of seeking, like, what's the next thing? And a form dropped in to say, like, oh, you can work with people like this. And it was kind of this map. And so I wrote the whole thing down, and it was just a framework, essentially, a framework that came through. And the next day, someone came up to me at the end of class and said, any chance you work one-on-one? And I was like, I do. I've got this whole system. It was like, really owned it, kind of in a funny way. I was like, okay, I'm just going to go with this, and the way it turned out, she happened to be a CEO of her company. And then within a month, I had 2 other CEOs happen to reach out to ask the same question. And so, that insight work initially was really about a way to bring an individual through the process of awakening that yoga provides. And just by happenstance, it ended up becoming leadership development work, because those were the people who were showing up. And so all of a sudden, from this original kind of intention to have it really be about an individual's awakening process of going from the felt to the seen to the known to the understood, to that, that process has really over the last 7 years revealed itself to me and kind of grown into what it is now, very organically. And so that's what comes up when I hear that question. It's a little bit of the process anyway. I know it's kind of a long answer, but it feels, it feels like a lot of steps in the process,
And I think that's the important part, I think, sometimes for people to realize, Kevin, is that a lot of this deeper work that is done in yoga and meditation is a lot of steps, and it's not a quick fix. And I'd love to talk to you about that 10 years that you had the ego, but you were doing yoga, you were teaching yoga. And what was there any other transformations and any sort of transcendence throughout that 10 years of just getting to classes and doing the work?
Man, well, so many things come to mind. I think about a couple different things that come up, which is, things that were going on personally. And then also, I've always kind of had a multi-pronged approach to my practice. So, there were a number of different modalities I was using to leverage my self-inquiry. So there was that, kind of getting into Qigong and getting into sort of a pretty extensive path with shamanism for about 10 years, and then also working with martial arts and so I guess I hear that question in a couple different ways, because there's the practice-based path, and then there was the sort of aspects of things that were being handed to me, like blows that were being dealt by the virtue of living life, that also shaped things. So, I guess I would say, which path would you rather I take?
Well, I guess we're on that path, like which so many people I think do. Were you just with the Qigong and everything? Were you just trying a whole bunch of different stuff to really give it a try and experience it and be open to it, or was there a bit more of a plan?
Yeah. It's funny, man. I really started out, yoga, I think, is so diverse in its applications. And it's one term, and that term is so broad, and it encompasses so many different things, And so at the time, I was doing physical yoga, and inadvertent, like unknowingly, I was doing a lot of Iyengar. And at the time, there was a form called Anyasara yoga, which has since kind of fallen away, but that was that was like the late 90s, and there was this very physical based practice that I was in, also doing a lot of Ashtanga. I was burning a lot of fuel, and I think that, to your point of like that ego, it was like I needed something to rub up against, or I needed something. I was essentially proving myself to myself in yoga, in a
Yeah.
way of like, oh, I can, like, I mean, I felt like I felt like such a, just a, it's the word that came to mind was like, I just felt like such an asshole my first time in class. I mean, I just really felt like I was critical and judgmental of myself and of the world I was seeing in there, but I didn't get the depth of what that what the implication of that was. I just was like frustrated. I was frustrated with what the practice was asking me to do. I was looking around the room going like, what the hell am I doing here? And so I needed friction at that time. I had a lot of anger, a lot of resentment. And so even though in that first phase of meeting yoga, I was like a little bit reluctant and resistant to the practices, there was something happening from the very first practice where I was like, there's something to this, but I don't like it yet.
Yeah, yeah.
And, and then what ended up happening was, when I went to my teacher training, I chose that particular teacher training because the yoga that I was doing and the yoga that teacher training was offering were like night and day. And it was totally confusing to me that you could have something called yoga that was like an Ashtanga yoga, and then you could have sort of classical Hatha yoga, and they were the same tradition. And so I picked my first course of study based on the fact that it was so counter to what I knew up to that point. And so that's something that like was just in me. You know what I mean? I wouldn't have conceived to diversify myself on purpose, but it was just a calling. It was like something was drawing me to what was unfamiliar. And so what ended up happening was that happened, and then that happened again and again and again and again. And I went into, like, I worked at a Bikram studio, signing in classes for people at the front desk for 2 years to see like, what the hell is this Bikram thing all about? And, and then started teaching at a Kundalini yoga shala that was, all Kundalini yoga. And I was like, I was teaching asana at a Kundalini studio, and, they had brought me in to teach the physical practice, but then all of a sudden I started studying Kundalini yoga and saying like, oh, okay, where does this fit in the canon? And then Qigong was a similar thing where I was like, wait a second, you're asking me to take my belly out, as I exhale? Like, everything in yoga was telling me to draw my navel in and back on the exhale. And went to this Qigong class and was saying, as you exhale, draw the belly out. And it was such a reverse experience for my abdomen and for the energy in my navel center that it was like, it flipped what I knew on its head. And so I kept really in that first 10 years, like seeking out the counter to whatever I was doing. And that ended up bleeding into like philosophy and looking into Vedanta and looking into Sankhya, the Sankhya philosophy, and all of these stones just started to unturn. So I mean, I'm sorry, I'm going on and on a bit, but there's so much in that history, and I haven't actually thought about it like this in such a long time. So it's really interesting to reflect on it.
Well, what I hear, Kevin, and I think it's just so important, the insights. But it's that what you feed, you become so much of without even knowing it. It's like, what you give energy to, that's who you're becoming. And if you're going to give that rub, you're going to rub harder sometimes without even realizing that that's what's happening, which, is so important for people to step back and be able to observe that a little bit, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And I think, for whatever reason, I had naturally been compelled to consider I was open, maybe is a better word to say. I was open to considering another way, or to consider an opposing force. Even in the power of yoga, I was like, this feels so good. And this feels so good to be in my body and to be opening my body and moving energy. But you're telling me there's another way to do it. Tell me more, instead of like what became my man. I mean, I don't know what it's like for you all culturally, but in the States, it was really a shit show in the 2000s as far as I was concerned, because man, it was like everybody choosing their style of yoga and saying, this is the way, and that always really was troublesome to me. It was like, well, there's just a bunch of different ways, not the way. And so I think there was an aspect of that as I started to soften, and as I started to soften my resistance that was, rooted in my own personal development, I started getting more curious about, the sort of many paths that will lead to a sort of similar truth. Yeah.
And have signs, through this conversation, have signs and signals, through just the calling, innate calling, have they always guided you, Kevin?
Yeah, that's, I would say yes. I mean, even take Thailand, for example, that was a very clear, even in the same way that we started this conversation saying like, I got your email and it was like, oh, this conversation is definitely a yes, and it was just a clear yes. And I remember back in 2005 when I got an email from somebody saying, you need to work with this guy. And it was just like, I got the hit of the yes right away. And I went and had a Thai massage. This was in New York City in 2005. And I went in to do this massage, 2-hour Thai massage with this kind of master practitioner. And I had no idea what I was getting myself into. I had never done it before. And yet I was called to it. And we ended up clicking into a zone where I inadvertently kind of started working with him in terms of the body work that he was doing and the sort of manipulation that he was doing. It was like I was breathing with it. I was following it. I was kind of becoming aware of how he was morphing the tissue, in through, let's say, in my legs or in the hips. And finding a way to create openings. And anyway, we ended up getting into like I think it was 1 p.m. in the afternoon when we started, and he got done, and it was 10 minutes to 6.
Wow.
And he basically was like, well, you need to go to Thailand, and I was like, kind of coming back from wherever I was, going like, what, and going like, that was super deep, that was a deep experience. And I look over at the clock and I was like, is it really 10 to 6 right now? And he's like, yep. And I was like, well, all right, man, I've got to be up on 108th in Amsterdam, which is like 50 blocks north of here, in 15 minutes to teach 2 classes back to back. And like, it was hysterical. And anyway, the reason that comes up is because he was like, well, listen, like, we kind of he gave me some magnesium, gave me some almonds, sent me on my way, but said like, listen, you need to go study with my teacher in Thailand. You're doing Thai massage already. You just don't know it.
Wow.
And, so I went up and I taught those classes from a seated position with my eyes closed, 2 hour-and-a-half classes. And they were like, it was something, and it was something. I was tapped into something else at that, in that. And then I went home, and it's funny to be telling this story. I really haven't thought about this in a while. And I went home and decided to sit in meditation, and it was probably around 10 o'clock at night. And I sat, and because of the body work, I felt like a floating spine. You know what I mean? My body was so open. There was no tension, and my spine was so awake and alert. And so I sat, and I went into this state, and I didn't know much about these kind of states back then, but I saw this. It's funny. I feel a bit, I can feel myself receding as I'm telling the story, because it sounds far-fetched, but it happened, and so I'm in this meditation, and I see this face of this guy going, come, 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 kind of impatiently going, come. And I come, the vision sort of starts to dissolve, and I come to, and it was one of those moments coming out of that meditative state of going like, okay, well, I don't know where I was, but I was somewhere, and that was a deep experience. And when I opened my eyes, it was daylight out, and it was almost 7 a.m. And I had been sitting there for like 8.5, 9 hours.
Wow.
And I had no experience in that kind of phenomenological event, and I'm not, and I just want to protect anyone who may be listening, who might be on the path of meditation or stepping onto the path of meditation. I don't tell this story lightly, and I also don't tell this story as if that's some sort of goal. You know what I mean? I just want to be mindful of that this was, I wouldn't suggest trying to seek out some sort of meditative absorption like that. That's not the point necessarily, but it's what happened. And I was like, well, the only thing I know is I'm going to Thailand. I don't know how this is going to happen, but I'm going to go. And 6 months later, I was on a plane and going to study with this guy who I had never met. His name's Pichette. He's kind of I didn't realize he was kind of like one of the lineage holders of Thai massage in Chiang Mai, Thailand. And so I show up in Chiang Mai, and I'm set to go see Pichette on Monday morning, and I get into Chiang Mai, and everybody's like, oh, you're going to study with Pichette. That's great. You must really know what you're doing. And I was like, Like, like I've never done a massage in my life. Like I don't, I really was, and I immediately got so scared
Yeah.
and was like, what the fuck have I done? And so I literally called Pichette up the night before I was scheduled to go in, and I called, and he gets on the phone, and he's like, yeah, and I said, hey, my name's Kevin Courtney, and your student Chris Ray, he suggested I come. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I said, I want to be sure that that I I don't have any experience, and are you sure this is okay? And I just talked, for like, I was just like, it was just fear coming out of my mouth, like, because all these people I had run into in Chiang Mai were like so surprised that I had never done massage, and I'm starting at Pichette, and so I get done kind of with my verbal sort of vomiting of this like, are you sure this is okay? And he's just silent, and I can hear, like, literally hear chickens in the background and hear, a baby crying. And so I know he's there, and he's just literally did not say anything for like, I'd say a minute and a half. And if, speaking of the ego, my ego was like, all right, well, it's his turn to talk. You know what I mean? Like I'm not saying anything. It's his turn to talk. And, after like a minute and a half goes by, which is a long time if you think about it, and he goes, well, I said, Pichette, and he's like, yeah. And I was like, well, what do you think? He's like, I think you're crazy. Just come, too much thinking. And that was my first lesson. And then when I got, so I went the next day, and sure enough, it was like, all the people there were like rip roaring practitioners from like all over the world. And I was super intimidated. I walked in and I saw him, and it was one of those moments where I was like, oh my God, man, that was the face that I saw. And, in that meditation, and I had not seen a picture of him, and I had no, I mean, I know what a scientist would say to reason away all of the possibilities that I had that kind of experience, in terms of like, I know how it sounds to the cynic or to the non-believer, but I mean, it happened, and there I was in this room with this man who then, and this will be the last thing I'll say on this, but he pointed to me as he started teaching, and he said, not good. This is not good. And I'm there on my first day to basically be living there for the next year, as far as I knew. And he said, stand up. And he asked me to stand up, and he's sitting at the front of the room, and there's, the 12 or 13 students in the room, and he's teaching to them about me. And he said, look, see, he's broken. Like this, see, his father died when he was young, and he's got this broken heart, and the right side of his heart's broken, and he comes to train to do Thai massage, but he's broken, and he's going to start doing, and then he's going to break people because he did it. And I'm just going, what the fuck is going on?
Yeah.
And I had never been with anybody that had any sort of capacity like that before. And he literally called out my life history, the most impactful moment in my life, he pointed to and said, essentially in so many words, sorry, buddy, like you don't get to start training yet. You need to heal more. And he instructed me to spend the next 2 weeks, doing this meditation and going to this temple. And then he had the students work on me for 2 straight weeks, just taking my body apart. And then after like 2 weeks was like, okay, now we start. And,
Wow.
So that's,
That's a,
yeah.
just to hear that story, Kevin, and to sit in that, there's so much for me that to unpack, or just to experience through that story is, is quite amazing. I can't. Firstly, what I take is that there's an openness for you to experience that meditation. And I know that you said that for people shouldn't strive for that, but you almost can't get to that level by just trying to get there. In my understanding, you're not going to get there by trying to get there. There's an expansion and an openness that's going to allow you there.
Yeah. Yeah.
But again, that scientific point of view, but that vibrational energy to experience people in a different way, I think so important. And I'd love to get your thoughts on that there's not just the mind or just what people say to be true, but there's energetic layers within the world.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that's, it's part of where I feel protective. It's funny because I really, some of, a story like that is not something I talk about that often, because it does, as you're saying, like there's a lot there to unpack. And I think that, I'm cautious with my words, in terms of, as a teacher and as a meditator, and not, I'm wanting to be mindful and thoughtful about what a story like that might do to a listener, but, because I don't want to create delusion or confusion or any sort of distraction, but that's sort of my sort of protective layer coming through. But what I'd say is, in terms of the quantum reality, or a more let's just speak in like basic terms to say, if the central nervous system and the spine and the systems in the glands in the brain, and the power of the instrument of the human being to be to be receptive, and to, in a sense, be the sort of conduit that it is, in my experience, in terms of when you disperse the magnitude of pain and trauma, or in my case, anger and resentment, and that instrument experiences less and less stagnant, old sort of constructs that start to break down in the process of self-study or self-exploration through meditation. When you begin to see yourself from outside of yourself, and the ego structures or the history of the memories starts to diffuse, and the discernment and the higher intelligence, the higher range of the mind, not necessarily the lower mind that feeds off of the senses or feeds off of those storylines or the ego structure, but when that starts to diminish and get quiet, and that static minimizes, while your relationship to awareness and to presence and to discernment and to what I would call like the higher mind, or the higher mind at its highest state of like spiritual discernment, the ability to discern real from unreal, or the ability to experience, like, let's say, an essential energy, something like someone might name consciousness, versus a consciousness that is presenting itself as something, which would be like the misidentification, that process. To me, the phenomenological experience of the noise being minimized and receptivity being maximized, to me, samadhi, that sort of eighth limb of yoga, in my understanding, which is limited by all of my own limitations of understanding, but I've had some experience in it. But that notion of samadhi to me is not this sort of this sort of unattainable arrival at unification where your individual self merges with that unified field, or the static is diminished enough for you to experience true, authentic unification. And whether you call it self or no self, whether you're a tantric or a Buddhist, whatever you want to call that empty fullness of pure union, that's the beginning. From my perspective, is like, that's not the end game, but that's a place from which, at least in the application of the yoga tradition, where you start to put samadhi to work, yeah, that's what comes up with that question.
Yeah.
For what that's worth.
No, and a lot of my studies and learnings have been around a Buddhist tradition, a more Buddhist look at, but again, to, just to sit with the body and breath as a starting point to create the space for stillness, that a lot of people don't understand just the importance of that mindfulness of body, and you've said it in your opening word, is feel until the felt becomes seen. And it's like that the ability to connect back with our body in its truest way is the gateway, I feel.
Totally. And I would say it only gets more true as you continue to acclimate to those states, and so I think, in that moment that you sort of earmarked to say, well, right, I hear you saying a state like that is not the goal, but then there also is this sort of driving force. And I think that desire to, everybody has their own reason for stepping into a practice, but shit, man, it seems like 9 times out of 10, it's like, I need help. I need something to change. Whatever's happening right now is not working. And so it does seem that they're well, certainly from, I think about, I'm very steeped now kind of in the Tantra worldview, which would say like the drive and the passion and the fire and the fuel for the understanding is that essential, or for the desire for the relief from suffering, or that driving, motivating force is so valuable, and then as we continue to evolve through that process of awakening, at least in the Yoga Sutras, they would say kind of towards the tail end of the last chapter of that book, like, okay, well, you've come this far, and the only thing standing in your way now is your desire to attain the very thing that you're, aiming to attain. So desire in the beginning is like essential. And then at some stage, it's essential that you let it go. And I think that's just like everybody's on their own node of that spectrum. So somebody's going to be like, desire is essential. And another person's going to be like, yeah, but it's the thing that gets in the way.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree completely with that. I'd love to know, mate, like how much work goes into your, what you do to get, such a broad and depth to what you understand, to be able to then meet people where they're at and give that teaching to them in the simplest terms that feels so basic but needs so much depth to come across so basic, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Especially in leadership.
Yeah. Well, it kind of splits my mind into a couple different directions, and one is I think on a more practical level for me, when I was teaching, I started teaching 22 classes a week or something like that, and so I was teaching a lot, and
Yeah.
then eventually it was like less and less and less until it was like I was teaching like 4 or 5 classes a week, and then I had my insight business starting. And but my point to saying that is to say for that time, so over a decade's time, I was looking through the lens every time I taught, and every time I taught a teacher training was, what do I need to do to speak to what I would call like the lowest common denominator in the class. So if I have a beginner in a class and they feel fucking lost, that's
Mm.
on me.
Yep.
It's on me. And so I spent a lot of years trying to thread that midline of, like, I want the most advanced practitioner to have a meaningful encounter with themselves, and I want that space to be simultaneously accessible and inspiring and meaningful to somebody who has who like to say step your right foot forward takes them a second to figure out which foot you're asking that, where everybody comes in is so uniquely different. So it's like, I think that was a practice to gain that sight, and I love that you're kind of taking the insight motto, in a way, because it's like I can apply that to, what was that felt thing that I needed to feel in the room until I could see it. And then, and as a teacher, what that was like, where, like, I'm looking at the practitioner and I'm going like, where are they? And what are they experiencing? And how do I need to phrase this to make a connection? And so that's a practice, I think.
Mm.
And it was something that I put a lot of time into practicing. And then I think there's also, a natural progression. I think back to 97, 98. So that's 23 years, and there were so many phases in that time where it was like I studied this for 10 years, or I studied this for 5 years, or I was deep into this tradition for 7 years. And, so I think there's no back to that original point, there's no substitute for what time and what experience will do to enable someone to articulate the complex in simple terms,
Yeah.
and I think that, so there's a byproduct there of just time and energy spent in these multiple traditions. And then in relationship to leadership, I think the thing, and I was, had had a moment, thankfully, to kind of do a little bit of looking into your work and seeing what you're doing in the world, and so I could make that connection. And so, I know you work in these domains, and I think so I can imagine you have a lot to say on this as well, as it relates to working with leadership, or working within organizations, or working as a coach or a mentor. And to me, the guiding principle that I use in working with leadership is, in the same way that I would attune my listening in meditation, like in the same way that I would go into that place where my ego and my mind were diminished, and I say diminished meaning like their amplification is quieted or focused. And so they're less in the way. And where I might go to listen to, let's say, creation in meditation, or attune to awareness, or turn my awareness in on awareness and then go through that portal into absorption, I would go into that. I do go into that space and then listen to the person from there. And what I find is, what I'm trying to hear is what's happening in that location for them, meaning what's happening in the root of their heart and in the essence of their essence. What is the pulsation that's at their essence? And that, someone might call that like helping someone discover their purpose. But for me, it's a listening in towards that place, essentially entering into that meditation with someone. And then from there, as a facilitator, at least of insight, as me practicing and being a facilitator of the process of insight, for my, in that model, I'm then, in a sense, sifting out the most dense part of the material, which ends up to be kind of like the biggest thing that's obstructing someone from themselves, experiencing the heart of themselves, and not necessarily naming that, but basically then starting to construct a path for them to come to see it themselves. And that's akin to that sort of, in a group field, I might be speaking to the lowest common denominator, but in a one-on-one, I'm getting access to that place and then trying to figure out a creative way for them to find it themselves so that they can discover it. And that's like I've never even put my work in those terms, but I would say that's the nature of my work.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree completely with what you just said then. I think for me, it's getting as much insight as I can through, different teachings, learnings, people, mentors. But then if I can't articulate that to the common denominator and make it palatable, it's useless. It's no point being in my head and them going, gee, he's smart, or he's got so many things, but I don't understand anything he's saying. As a facilitator or coach, it doesn't help the person. And I think there's a lot of work that gets done in that space to actually get it across the line where they're like, that makes sense to me in my life today. That's where I sort of, in its simplest form, try and start. But I'd be interested, Kevin, to understand how much, is there a work and process that you do, or is this just a natural coming together of everything you've done, from Thai massage to all the different yoga and meditations and retreats you've been on? What do you bring with you in the day-to-day teachings and facilitation? Is that articulated and used carefully, or does it just come into your being and you're like, I'll use that today, that makes sense to me?
Yeah, it's funny, man. It was one way for a long time. Like, my approach, probably I would say, like, it started as me drawing everything out. So I drew out my lesson plans, I drew out stick figures, I wrote out certain maybe philosophical aspects that I wanted to bring into a class, and I would have like sheets and sheets of notebooks of class plans. I did that for like 4 years, and then I said, like, okay, what would happen if I stopped doing that? And I then would go in and just go into meditation before I taught, and wait until I heard something, and then start teaching a class. And that was probably about 10 years of my work, was based on the phenomenon of listening and creating on the spot, and just letting it reveal itself. And what's funny is that when I went from, because I had studied Iyengar yoga for just about 10 years with a teacher, Nikki Costello, who's just a great resource. She's a brilliant teacher. And she, when I kind of inadvertently went from her being my main source of as a teacher, and the Iyengar method being my main sort of yogic path, to coming into Tantra, and specifically like Tantric Hatha yoga, which has such a specific approach. And so 2015, 2016 became the first time I went back to then doing really specific lesson plans, because in the Tantric Hatha tradition, there's that notion of krama, or that notion of sequence. And so if you're going to try to leverage the body and the breath in a way to create a very specific kind of result, that requires a certain kind of acuity and a certain kind of focus that I then came back to, like writing all the lesson plans back out. And so it's interesting. I've gone a couple different routes, and then with the insight work, and when I work with in the realm of leadership, I'm currently actually creating a whole path to apprentice facilitators to be able to start being a facilitator for insight specifically. So I'm currently doing like way bigger project than I imagined, which is to map out the insight process as I see it, because it's like, shit, it feels spontaneous. And I wonder if you have this experience too. I mean, when I'm with someone, I feel like I am just responding spontaneously. But when I go to think about having someone else come in and do this work as a facilitator, I'm actually working off a framework that, I mean, so far I'm at about 200 pages of a manual that I thought was like, a few notes, you know what I mean? And it's like, so the framework is like deep and vast, but it's not in my front. It's not at the foreground of my awareness, you know. It's like, it's just baked in now. So, but that's again, man, I really do hope, anybody in a similar field, if they're getting anything from this conversation, like really, that is such a central theme that's coming through, of time and sort of stages, and that the path is sort of a one of evolution and integration and calibration. And so, I really think there's merit in making a real good, solid plan, and then putting that whole thing down and letting what wants to happen.
I always try to, the process I try to go it's very well thought out beforehand, and a little bit prescriptive, but it comes across to the client or to the customer as very, very organic.
Yeah.
That's where the sweet spot for me is, that it doesn't feel like it's a push. It's an organic, heartfelt session or lesson, but there's a lot of work that's been done to get it to that place for me.
Totally. Yeah.
I had a bigger question for us just to discuss, and I just wanted to get your thoughts and feelings on, where do you see, with everything that's happened in the last year, where do you see spirituality and consciousness? Where are we heading with this? Like, what's the movement? What's the feeling energetically where you're living?
Well, man, I really, a lot comes up with that question. I think that, so I'm in Brooklyn, New York, and so, there's so many things happening here in the States. I mean, not only globally do we have COVID and the sort of dismantling of so many norms, but here in the States, I won't go into a direction of getting too far into it, but there's, from my perspective, there's just so much dysfunction and uh, overt manifestations of dysfunction and sort of corrupted uh, power structures and it's really, to me, the sort of systemic sickness of the systems that are at the foundation of our cultures are really being tested. The systems are being tested and pushed to their edge, and so many people suffering economically, and then a lot of sort of personal dissolution for so many people, even the people that I'm working with in leadership, who aren't being financially threatened necessarily, are kind of have had gone through their own existential sort of recalibration with the world kind of pausing in this big movement. And so I think for me, the first thing that comes up is the resilience and stability that's been the result of being in relationship to if I were to say like a spiritual aspect of like relating to, let's say, my essence or the unchanging, if there's an unchanging aspect of me, I might call that essence or that consciousness a spiritual realm, and so if I'm in that domain where I'm really in the essence of my essence, and that essence doesn't sway when things fall apart or when people die, or when, I mean, we've all go or gone through life, and have these life experiences, but to not be annihilated by them, to suffer the sort of consequence of them, to feel the pain, and then, on the light side of things too, to, be with the potential, and as things fall apart, well, there's potential for regeneration and for new ways. And so innovation and technology, like advancements in medicine or technology, so the tide kind of can turn from the sort of bleak existential crisis to, we can also, depending on, which side of the conversation we're having, we could be talking about all the potential. And I think for me, where spirituality or practices that will bring someone closer to the essence of who they are, that that thing that, like, well, how yoga would really talk about the practice is, this practice is, in some circles they'll say this is a practice of learning how to die well. And so the value of that learning how to die well can't be more relevant, and from the metaphoric deaths to the material deaths to the, personal ones, to the psychological ones, to, all the different forms. So I think that I get, being here and being in my particular position of wanting to be of service and wanting to maintain a certain focal point on illumination and wellness and wholeness. It gets frustrating sometimes to see where the general population is having, what level of the conversation is at in the general like culture and population. I get a bit, I can get a bit disappointed in it. Yep. And so where I turn my focus at that point is into the value and the merits and the degree at which the deepening of consciousness, one's consciousness or one's self-awareness or one's self-actualization, one's spiritual attainment of a level of depth of relationship to the essence of their own power is the thing that enables someone to take responsibility for themselves and to take care of their communities well, and to stand strong on, to stand upright and have your heart open and be able to focus forward I can't think of a more relevant skill than that.
Yeah.
And so to me, that's the place where spirituality and these sort of conscious conversations have their place, in today's world.
Yeah. No, I feel blessed, mate. I feel, in some ways, feel really blessed to be doing the work that we're doing at this particular time. As much as it can sometimes be disheartening right now, I just think there's going to be a shift and a need for an elevation in people's energy and their psyche, and that we actually get that opportunity to help support and create those shifts within people in a time where I think they're going to need it in the coming years more than ever.
Yeah. I mean, my mind right now in answering your question is sort of rooted in some more local constructs in terms of like American politics and the American culture at large, but to the point of where I feel you really directing your focus is on a much bigger map of where. Well, gosh, a lot. I have a handful of clients that work in global economic policy and finance, and so there's that world. But then there's the environmental, the realities of like, man, who really? I wonder, if we're going to look back at 2020 and be like, wow, remember how easy 2020 was, and how far will this go in terms of the sort of, I think about water and water resources and, good, like people having access to resources and it really, to me, that edge of where we are, to your other point that I hear, is like, whether this is just optimism or whether this is spiritual development, I feel like the inner resources people are currently discovering right now, and the things that are emerging out of folks that are going through the sort of duress of these times, is going to manifest itself in such extraordinarily powerful ways, and where we have the potential to go as we engage with these things and learn how to essentially stabilize and be well in the face of all this, I think we're going to experience some extraordinary representations of human potential, amidst all of what all of that other side of the coin.
Yeah. And because I think it's a drawn out process, but I'm just reading your bio before we started, and, talking about September 11 being, an instrumental moment for you. I feel like this is almost that enhanced or elevated a little bit for people when they get the chance to step back and observe just how monumental this particular time was in their transformational development. That's why I just think there's opportunity there.
Yeah, I mean, I think back to March, when the states first shut down, and everybody was in the beginning phase of it. There was coherence, everybody was like, oh, we're in a there's some gravity to this situation. And there was at least a felt sense that there was a coherent humbling that happened, and it felt global. It certainly felt global for a little while there. And I know it was really interesting because I was saying to Natalie, my I was going to say girlfriend, but I'm thinking like fiance, future wife. I was saying like, this is the time, this is the time. And there was the development that happened in terms of my insight, the practitioners, or, that's kind of what I refer to my clients as practitioners. The development that happened from March to June was what in those individuals, and some of those individuals are not in the spiritual world. They're way out of the circle of they're quiet about their spiritual practices because they're in very different worlds, where there's more of a sort of general inspiration towards meditation now on a corporate level, but a lot of people weren't sort of wearing their meditation badge on their sleeve, for a lot of years. But so those folks that are not necessarily in like a spiritual community, but are in a more conservative institution, the evolution that happened between March to June was, I felt like hit the accelerator on this, and so it was one of those things where it's like, well, there's the shadow side of COVID, and then there is this other opportunity that's sitting amidst this duress, that is people really getting humbled and checking their values out with some sincerity, and I don't know about you in your work, but when the whole machine of culture and business and organizations are pressing forward just cyclically quarter after quarter after quarter, and there's just a growth mindset in certain ways, they're having all of that stop for a moment and everything's shut down was like this massive expanse of an opportunity for people to get real. And to your point about that juxtaposition of 9/11, it's like, for sure. And that was, New York was a different place that year. And then it was 2002 and it was 2003 and things kind of recalibrated back to a new normal. But this was a different check on the collective psyche, I feel like, another level.
It's that mass, when your material, when your superficial status driven lives become compromised and the vulnerabilities of all that starts to really show up, I think some people then want to go inward beyond the egoic inward and actually find a deeper sense of self. And that's what I sort of have discovered, that people realize the impermanence of life now, not just from deaths, but the impermanence of business, leadership, relationships, everything, and understand that this is not fixed and this is not how it will be forever. And that can either put fear in people or it can, put awakening, I think, in people.
Totally. It certainly is the mirror that shows you where you stand on that spectrum. Yeah.
Mate, I'll let you go because I know you've got a lot on today, but I deeply, deeply appreciate the conversation and the depth that we got to go to today. And I feel like, we could do multiple episodes to talk through topics. There was a lot of space within this conversation. So I do really appreciate that, because that's exactly what the purpose of the podcast is about. So thanks, man. It was really, really beautiful.
Awesome, Luke. Yeah, well, I'm really, again, grateful for your sincerity in the questions too, and just being able to, uh, for me to sort of think about these things in the way that you're asking about them is, I really sincerely appreciate that too. So thank you.